Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. 15 minutes is going to be a challenge to talk about what's going on in the economies of Europe, particularly after the earlier discussion. But I hope to make, anyway, a few comments, and I hope that they're useful to you. My starting point has been working for about 36 years now on how you apply the Bible to public policy, from when I was working with the World Bank down in Tanzania, as you heard, working in private business, and more recently running various non-profit organizations. And currently my main activity is trying to take the idea of what we call relational analytics into the way that companies operate, helping them measure stakeholder relationships, and therefore getting the language of relationships into major corporates in South Africa and the UK. We recently produced a major report, Transforming Capitalism from Within, the title of this session. This is aimed at corporates and how they organize themselves. It suggests 10 points for the reform of corporations and a relational ratings agency, like a credit ratings agency, written by a senior lawyer in the city, working with myself as an economist. So if you're really interested in how to reform corporates, then please take a look at that. At a more mundane level, middle manager level, we produced a book called The Relational Manager. And at the level of how you run an economy, what you might do in the current situation in Europe and so on, this book, After Capitalism, Rethinking Economic Relationships, is what we would suggest, because as you will see from my brief presentation, I'm challenging Christians not to think that you can tweak capitalism and get something consistent with Christianity. It's a much more root and branch reform that we require. And the question is, how do you do that? And what is the teaching of the Bible that points us in that direction? And how do we implement it? So if you'd like to follow my argument, as I have to go rather quickly through it, it is on a sheet of paper, which is on the tables. Please grab a copy of that outline and just follow the argument as I go through. Thank you. My old professor at Cornell University in the States, where I did my PhD, said that good policy follows from good analysis. And therefore I decided I needed to focus this short session, it's now about 12 or 13 minutes, on what the problem is, and point you to where you can read about the policy outcomes that I'm proposing, rather than jump straight to the solution. Unless you're convinced that the diagnosis is right, you won't be very interested in the policy outcomes. That's my argument. So point one on the sheet is arguing, very much in line with Christian democratic tradition, that one needs to look at the world through a relational lens primarily, rather than a financial and environmental lens. Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor. On these two commands hangs all the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets includes the financial and the environmental. So I think Jesus is saying that the relational has to take priority over both the environmental and the financial. We have to think about financial issues in terms of the relational dynamic that they create, rather than vice versa as we do at the moment. The center of our thought universe, if you like, is that money is the center of the universe, and relationships have to make good as much as they can in order for us to achieve our financial targets. What I'm suggesting is a Copernican type of revolution, where we make relationships the center of our thought universe, and the financial operation has to serve the interests of relational outcomes. That is really turning the thing on its head. And again, what advice does the Bible give us as to how we do that? The second fundamental assumption I'm making, which is a very radical assumption, even to most evangelical Christians who say they believe the Bible, and this is where I depart most fundamentally from personalism and the Christian democratic tradition, if you like, is that biblical law is the design of a relational God for a relational society. Biblical law is the design of a relational God for a relational society. Now, we have hiccups on bits of biblical law, mainly because we haven't studied them enough. There's a major book on the bookstand there called God, Justice and Society by a reader in biblical law at Bristol University who used to be at the Jubilee Center, which I founded in 1983, Now, Jonathan Burnside will take you through many of the difficult passages in biblical law and show how fundamentally relational they are and why they are coherent. We need to recover the same confidence in our scriptures as the Muslims have in the Quran. We lack confidence in our own scriptures. And the key point where we lose the argument publicly is on biblical law. We need to go back to that material. We need to believe it was inspired by God. We need to study what it says in its cultural context and be ready to answer the arguments. But we believe that the Bible itself in biblical law provides teaching on how you run an economy. What are the key components? There is a problem of taking it from a pre-industrial society into the modern day. Yes, that's true, but we argue biblical law was given for all time by God, not just temporarily. And human beings shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So why have we cut this part, my brothers and sisters, out of our thinking? Why have we excised the law from our thinking about politics and economics when it's all about politics and economics? We need to have the confidence to get back to it. There are 2 points to make on the implications of taking biblical law seriously for the market and the state. This may seem a technical point, but it's a very vital point. What biblical law endorses is markets for goods and services. So if you say to a Christian, do we support the market? We should say, yes, if you mean a market for goods and services. But if you mean a market for capital, land, and labor, the answer, I think, must be no. Because on all of those 3 things, on capital, land, and labor, biblical law suggests major interventions into those markets. Because if you don't intervene in those markets, you will end up with a great deal of injustice. So you have a ban on interest, i.e., we must prevent debt. All debt is written off every 7th year. Is this really impossible? Is this really so stupid? The German government is approaching that kind of idea now. But why so late? And also, the problem with giving the state a great big role, as Keynes and others have argued in the past, the problem of giving the state such a big role is that it takes decision-making away from families and communities. And if you do that, you take away the foundation on which relationships are built at the family and community level. If families and communities don't make decisions governing economic activity and welfare, that kind of thing, you make them, I think somebody called them, the home a multi-purpose leisure center. It just is reduced to something trivial. So my second proposition is that financial capital is destroying relational capital. Look at pay differentials across Europe. The person on the supermarket desk or in the supermarket taking the payments is getting less than 1% of the salary of the managing director of every major supermarket in Europe, I'd be prepared to bet. In Britain, it's something like 1 to 500 ratio. Do we believe all people are created equal? What kind of equality is that? Why are Christians not saying that this ratio is unacceptable? We don't believe it's right before God. It's not an expression of loving your neighbor to pay such a huge differential. Look at the long and unsocial working hours. What's it doing to our families that people are having to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week? Look at debt, the impact of debt personally. We did a study from our Cambridge research base on this across Britain. We took over 1,000 multiple debt cases. The consequences of debt at a household level is child abuse, it's divorce, it's wife battering, it's all kinds of stuff. Debt has hugely negative relationship consequences. If we believe relationships are important as Christians, and surely we do, my brothers and sisters, surely we believe that relationships is how God will evaluate our lives, that our concept of God as Trinity is relational. The incarnation is relational, God with us. The cross is relational, about reconciliation. Heaven is going to be about the church as a relational community taken into eternity. Everywhere you look in Christianity, it's relationships. We're being asked to make relationships the center of our thinking. Why don't we worry about debt at a personal and family as well as a national level? What about intergenerational debt? Someone has coined the term fiscal child abuse as what is going on in Western countries at the moment. Fiscal child abuse. Because we are abusing and exploiting our children in the way that we're organizing the tax system to benefit us at the expense of our children. It's a huge Ponzi scheme, in effect. And mobility. Mobility of capital leads to mobility of labor. Mobility of labor breaks up extended families so they can't care for each other, breaks up communities, it breaks up relationships that should be mutually supportive. So I'm on to point 3 on my sheet, and I hope I haven't almost run out of time, haven't I, Jeff? Never mind. A few more minutes. So what I'm arguing is that all of us who have pensions with private pension agencies are part of the problem. Because what we are doing is we are taking our savings and we're putting that savings into the market. And we don't know where the money goes. It goes to a pension fund, a trust. From there it goes to a fund manager. From there it may go into a bond or into an equity. We know not, we care not where. Now we as Christians are responsible for our savings. And we have no idea where the savings have gone. Well, you say, when I meet the Lord, I'll tell him I got 6% rate of return on my savings. But my neighbor, Jeff, he only got 5% on his, so I had a better stewardship of my money than he did. But my brother, won't God say to us, I'm not interested in whether it was 6 or 5%. I want to know, where did the money go? Well, I put it into Standard Life. And actually, it happens that Standard Life was supporting pornographic websites. Oh, great. So my savings contribute to pornographic websites, gambling websites on the web. Is that really what God wants us to do with our savings? Don't we have a responsibility to know where our savings go and how they're used? Christians have got to start by saying, what capital have I got and how is it being used and how do I take responsibility for it? So Jesus makes this point, I think, in the parable of the talents. Because what Jesus puts in the mouth of the master in the parable of the talents is these words. He says to the man who buried his talent in the ground, he says, so you knew, did you, that I was a hard man? Hard means unrelational, uncaring. A hard man who reaps where he doesn't sow. Well, if that's the kind of man I am, the master says, you should have put my money in the bank and I would have got it back with interest. Because what banks do is put a Chinese wall between the lender and the borrower. Once you put your money in the bank, you have no idea from there where the money goes. And I'm saying that's wrong. That as Christians, we need to know where it goes and how it's used. We end up like absentee landlords. We want to take the profits with no engagement and no involvement. That takes me to point 4, which I don't need to dwell on, but it's a very important point, that risk does not by itself justify reward. Many Christians say, I put my money on the stock exchange, I took a risk, so I'm entitled to a reward. And I'm saying the person betting on horses on the race course is making exactly the same argument. What's the difference between betting on the stock exchange and betting on horses? From the lender's point of view, it's the same proposition. I track the company or I track the horse, I decide which one's best, I put the money on and I take the profit. But there's no responsibility, there's no involvement, and there's no participation. And that takes me to my last point. There is one diagnosis. I'm making the same diagnosis as Karl Marx and as John Maynard Keynes. That quote at the top of this piece of paper that I handed out to you is really worth reflecting on, not least because John Maynard Keynes made that quote in the Yale Review in 1933 at the beginning of the last Great Recession. And I firmly believe we're into 10 years of severe recession as we work our way through this huge debt overhang that we are facing. But the Christian solution is different from those of Marx. We're not seeking a revolution, at least not a violent revolution. We don't believe that the answer lies in asking governments to repair the relational damage. The conclusions that we've been reaching on the kind of way that you create a relational economy might be summarized in just 3 terms, but I'm afraid you'll have to read the book, this book, After Capitalism, Rethinking Economic Relationships, if you want to find out really what we are suggesting. But the 3 areas are: we need some new institutions. We need new institutions. And we call those things like family associations, making extended families into viable economic units for insurance and savings and purchases and so on, regional investment trusts, regional stock exchanges, and so on. Secondly, we need a new growth strategy. And we've built our ideas there around Michael Porter's relational concept of centers of excellence. And thirdly, we believe there needs to be a new approach to welfare, because somehow we've got to get governments out of the middle, central governments out of the middle of welfare provision. It was a huge mistake to get into it in the first place. We've got to get governments out of it. That won't be easy. It will take a period of time, but we believe there are ways to move towards it. So there's no short-term, quick fix solution to Europe's problems. What there is a long-term strategy which will mean that we're not just fixing the short-term problems. Actually, what we're doing is building a new set of foundations on which the European economy can be built and can be competitive in the long term against Asia and the other parts of the world. The sooner we start, the sooner we will get our lives back in order. But at the moment, we're doing exactly what we told the Asians not to do. We told the Asians in 1999 to 2002, fix the debt quickly, negotiate, get yourselves out of this debt by any means you can, but fix it quickly so that you can get onto a growth path again. And what we're doing is exactly the opposite. We are struggling and struggling and struggling to stop any crisis coming. We are accumulating the debt more and more and more and more, and the consequence is going to be that when the crash comes, as it has to do, because it's unsustainable, then the building up process will take longer. Thank you, Jeff.
Stay there, Michael. Just stay there. Are there any quick questions for Michael? Kishore. Kishore's from the Acton Institute based in Rome.
It's a long time since I read the distributists, I have to say, probably about 25 years since I last read them, although I did do some work on them once upon a time. Certainly, I believe in the concept that in the same way that in the Old Testament, the goal was that every family should own its own home. That is, what you're effectively doing is strengthening household balance sheets, if you like, putting it into modern language. Certainly, I would feel that that was a really serious objective for policy. You know, what would it take to say that we need every household to own its own piece of property, even if it's a flat, because 30 to 50% of people's income is spent on servicing their debt for housing generally. And also, how do we construct a housing market where instead of going to the bank for a mortgage, you have shared equity models? So we've been working again on how you construct today shared equity arrangements for house purchase. But the fundamental proposition is that if you have capital, how do you engage in a way that makes you responsible? So it's difficult to go in one jump to that. You have to go through some stages. But we have this motto, like, do you remember the American Revolution said no taxation without representation. And we're saying no reward without responsibility, no investment without involvement, no profit without participation. And we would like to see Christians make that their battle cry going forwards into this recession.
One question from Eva.
Just a little one. Are your proposals close to what engaged Protestant Christians in the 19th century developed, cooperative institutions to share what one has and what another lacks? They have become banks, enormous banks, but in the origin it was cooperative sharing of means in order to create progress. Yeah. Is that a bit what you're saying?
Yes, in a nutshell, yes. That is, I think that the Christians in the 19th century, even though they had not based their thinking sufficiently closely, in my view, on the biblical text, had stumbled towards the kind of solutions that Christians should go for. So things like, as you say, cooperatives, various forms of mutuals, small mutuals, credit unions, I mean a whole range of institutions, housing associations. The difficulty was they got so big. And when you get size coming in, you contravene one of the 5 key laws, if you like, of right relationships, which we've taken from Scripture. Because relationships are about 5 areas: communication, story, knowledge, power, and purpose. And you have to work in those 5 areas to get relationships right. So what they were doing was trying to create mutuality. I'm going over time.
So I hope that that's whetting your appetite to get a hold of After Capitalism. This book here, Transforming Capitalism from Within, you can download as a PDF from the site for free. I don't know how many copies of this you have with you. 10. So the rest of you can download it for free. Thank you, Michael. I hope that will stimulate some thinking for your engagement tomorrow.